Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar Managing Through Drought, the fourth webinar in our series of webinars. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Rose Daniel and I'm the Technical Manager with APAL. Over the last few years, we've seen the impacts of limited water availability on apple orchards around a number of regions. And today you'll be hearing from Mark Skews, a research scientist with the South Australian Research and Development Institute, who will discuss his research looking at on-farm monitoring in irrigated citrus, almond, avocado and grapevines in the Riverland and Sunraysia regions during the Millennium Drought. Mark will outline some of the techniques used by growers and how their actions affected the survival, productivity and recovery of orchards. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Mark Skews. Mark has worked at the Loxton Research Centre in South Australia for 30 years and has extensive experience in all aspects of irrigation management, including irrigation scheduling and soil and plant water monitoring. Mark has developed a system for benchmarking irrigation management in horticulture, developing with a smartphone app for assessing water stress in vines, and is part of a team establishing the Almond Centre of Excellence Research Orchard at Loxton in collaboration with the Almond Board of Australia. He managed a project monitoring the impacts of the Millennium Drought on permanent irrigated crops in the Riverland and Sunraysia, which he is speaking about today. So Mark, it's my pleasure now to hand over to you.
Thank you. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is work that I did during the Millennial Drought, when allocations of water in the Murray-Darling system were very low. So I was working with irrigated horticulture, citrus, almonds, vines, looking at how people managed their water allocations in their crops through that pretty stressful time. I'll just share my presentation and we can get started. Once I get that working. There we go. So we did a few different things during that period. One of the things we did was to actually monitor what people were doing on their farms. And that's what I'll talk about first. And just to acknowledge that Hort Innovation, or HIA as it was called in those days, were the funder of this work. So during that period, allocations in South Australia dropped to pretty low levels. You can see there on the graph in 2005-06, the green bar shows that allocations were at 100%, but they dropped to 60% the following season, down around 30%. And in 2008-09, I think it was 16% was the final allocation. And a lot of times the allocation started at 0 or 2% at the beginning of the season, which was pretty confronting. Also, you can see there the rainfall in the blue dots is, during that period was quite low as well. And so the combined amount of water that people had available was pretty poor. And that caused a lot of worry, concern, panic among growers as to how they were going to keep their crops alive and keep producing. We followed those properties through. We started our monitoring work in 2007-08 when things really bit for growers, and we followed that through until recovery in 2011-12. And even in 2010-11, allocations were around 65%, but there was pretty good rainfall in that year, so that helped as well. So those last 2 years were better, a bit easier for growers, but we followed the growers through to that recovery phase. This map shows the location of the sites, and so it was a tri-state project. We had sites across South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria on the Murray-Darling system. And that's probably key to some of the strategies that were used by growers. And across those sites, we had a range of different crops. As you can see there, the majority of the plantings that we monitored were almonds or citrus. And so that's really where we concentrated our efforts. and that's the data that I'm going to show you today. So one of the things we did with the data we collected from there was to look at yield according to how much water was applied, and just plot all of the data points we collected from all those individual plantings, and try and understand the relationship between yield and applied water. So you can see here, this is data for almonds. We've got all the different seasons there from 2007-8 through to 11-12. And we've drawn a line towards the top of that data set. There's a particular mathematical way of doing that, but it kind of puts an envelope around all that data to say, here's where the kind of rough maximum is for yield at any of those applied water amounts. So just for reference, 1,000 millimetres is 10 megalitres a hectare. So 100 mils is a megalitre per hectare. So you can see here that the maximum yields for almonds were around the 1,500 millimetres, or 15 megalitres per hectare. And as soon as you started to drop below that level, you immediately lost yield. In terms of, this is just another way of looking at that data with the applied water, same axis across the bottom, but yield index, which is tonnes per megalitre of water applied. You see that the most efficient in terms of water was actually near 1,200 or 12 megs a hectare, was where you got the best yield for the amount of water put on. And that's worth thinking about in a water short year, that it may be more efficient to actually not worry about maximising yield per hectare, but think about yield per water, because water is the limiting factor. Another set of data looking at yield, but looking at that in relation to stress coefficient. So this is across the season, on any day you can calculate, is there sufficient water for maximum evapotranspiration, which means that the stress coefficient is 1 down the left-hand end, so there's no restriction to evapotranspiration. 0 at the far end of the graph means that there's no water available and the tree's not transpiring at all, and everywhere in between means that there's a limited amount of water, but the tree is able to transpire, but is limited, and that's limiting its production and growth. And on average over the season, we had a bit of a range there in how stressed the trees were on average, and that is reflected in the yield. Just run quickly through some data for citrus, and it is reasonably similar. Again, the maximum yields were around, in this case, around 13 megs per hectare for citrus. Dropped off as you came below that. Interesting to note, it actually drops off as you go above that as well. So more water is not always better. The irrigation water use index is around 900, 950 millimetres for citrus as the best efficiency per water applied. And again, the seasonal stress coefficient shows a pretty clear response, that as there is more stress through lack of water through the season, the yield drops off fairly clearly. So that's an interesting set of data, and it tells us a little bit about how water affects productivity in almonds and citrus. But what's more important is, okay, I've got less water than I need. I know I'm going to have some issues. What can I do? How do I manage that? So we really, the key part of the project was to look at the strategies that growers used and how did they manage their water to make the best use of it. One of the strategies used was to lease or buy water. Now, I said before, this was all done on the Murray-Darling Basin system, and that is a key to this being an option, because I'm sure for some of you that isn't an option. There's no other water that you can access. But in this case, there were other sources of water. There was the option of the water market. The use of that water market really came down to the crop type and then the quality or the value of the particular variety and planting in question. So it became very clear very quickly to almond growers that the lost productivity from reducing water was worth more money than the water that they needed to buy to make up their loss. So the almond growers very quickly went out and leased water, and that's how they managed through the drought on the whole. Citrus, some varieties, good young productive plantings, good quality fruit, that was sometimes an option. In other cases it wasn't. And in grapes, that wasn't an option at all, because grapes really weren't worth anything at the time. This is a much more common scene for the grape industry, and the citrus industry. There was a fair bit of this went on as well. Consolidating water, removing some plantings so that the water could be spread across other varieties, other plantings, where it might actually be worth more money in terms of the yield and the quality of the fruit that was produced. So that is a real option on a larger property, particularly where you've got a variety of different plantings, selecting which plantings to keep, which plantings to remove, and putting the water you do have available on a smaller area. Another thing that people did was to look at their irrigation systems and to convert their systems. So a lot of people converted to drip. The photos here show overhead sprinklers being converted to drip. The idea being to minimise evaporation of water and try and get as much water to the plants as possible, rather than losing it to the environment. And PRD, is partial root zone drying, is a technique that is really alternate wetting and drying, alternate irrigation of different sides of the tree row, to trick the trees into thinking they're in drought and reducing their water use. So trying to make the tree use less water and therefore make the water go further. Another option was partial cover sprinklers, so adjusting sprinkler systems so that the water wasn't spread into the mid-row where it was going to be more prone to evaporation, but trying to keep it in under the canopy in the shade where the evaporation would be less. Those particular last few strategies are about managing the irrigation system and where the water's applied. Some of the other options that people tried were actually manipulating the trees. So hedging and topping was something that became fairly common. Cutting back trees, reducing the canopy so that reduced the demand for water, and trying to manage those trees as smaller trees, less water demand, less water application. Another idea in the same line was to top work trees, and a number of growers who had been thinking about converting a variety from, converting plantings from a particular variety to a new variety that was potentially worth more money. So that was, there was a lot of that happened in a hurry during the drought, because it was an opportunity not only to renew the orchard but to reduce water use as well. So really you're chopping the tree back to maybe a quarter of what was previously there, so you've got a lot less water use, and you're renewing the tree so that it comes back. And at the end of the drought you've actually got an improved planting, more higher value crop, young trees that are producing big quality fruit. Another option in reducing water use, but more severe, was skeletonizing, and this was done again. Here's a citrus orchard where the trees were pretty much cut back to nothing. Obviously yield is affected, badly affected, but it does save water. And again, the idea was that by the end of the period of drought, these trees would still be alive, they'd be renewed and yielding, giving good quality fruit. And so looking not just in the short term, but in the longer term to what are the long-term options. Other things that were done, anti-transpirant sprays to try and stop the trees from transpiring, removing crop so that that reduced the stress on trees was another thing that was tried. Question is, how did all that, there's a lot of stuff done there which ones worked, what didn't work. So if we look at almonds, we actually did some statistical analysis to see what strategies actually helped, which ones perhaps didn't help in terms of yield, giving good yield with reduced water. Obviously, the top one there, applied water, lots of green ticks. If you put more water on, you got more yield. So if you've got that option, it's going to work. Moving down the table, there are other things that were tried and maybe had some impact in some seasons or didn't. Where there's no symbol, there was no significant difference. Anti-transparent, the only result we got there was in 2010-11, it appeared to actually have a negative impact on yield. So that's not ideal. Crop removal certainly had an impact in the year when the crop was removed, but it didn't really have any impact longer term. Converting to drip did produce some improvements in some years. Unfortunately, I guess when you convert from one system to another, you do actually have a short-term impact on the trees, so they're not going to respond straight away with improvements. In fact, they may go backwards. There were some, some small improvements in some years. Drip versus sprinkler, we did show in a couple of years that drip irrigated blocks that were already drip irrigated did show better yield per water applied than sprinkler blocks. Reducing the wetted area appeared to have some impact, and critical stress in the season and across the season, and also in the critical periods of flowering and fruit set, obviously they had a negative impact if you had stress in those periods. If we look at the same data in citrus, again, applied water, tick, 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 good thing to do. Crop removal, much the same in that there was a negative effect in that first year, no significant effect in any particular year after that, but across the total of those 5 years, there was an increase in overall yield by removing crop in that first season when things were really critical. So that's a bit of a mixed message, interesting. Hedging and topping, obviously, again, because you're hacking into the tree, in the year that you do that, you do lose yield. But we had some good positive responses later on from doing that early in the season, early in the drought. In later years, there were improvements in yield from those patches. Skeletonizing obviously had a big impact in the first couple of years, but again, there was a response later on where those trees actually yielded quite well in the recovery phase, so they recovered well. Partial cover, sprinkler, again, there was some improvement there some of the time in 1 year. Converting to PRD showed some response. Drip versus sprinkler again showed some response, but then in other years it wasn't the same. It was the other way around, so that's not really clear. And again, seasonal stress. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about a research trial that we also carried out. And this was a trial where we trialled some moderate deficit irrigation and some extreme deficit. And the extreme deficit was about keeping the trees alive. The moderate deficit was about trying to maintain productivity. And so there were some different cultural treatments applied, but they were aimed at either maintaining yield or just keeping the trees alive. We did that for 1 or 2 years, but we monitored across 4 years. And I just want to show you 2 very small bits of data from that. One is in terms of fruit load. So the idea in the red bars, which are the extreme deficit, was to try and take the crop off to minimise the stress on the trees. What you'll notice is that their starting fruit load before we applied our treatments was higher than the moderate deficit, and they were higher than the control, and that's a response from the tree. We'd already put the drought on. The trees responded by saying, I'm in a drought, I've got less water, I need to flower, I need to reproduce. And so they put a lot of flower on. We then applied our treatments, and you can see in the second lot of data on the right we have reduced the crop. But what's really interesting is the diamond shape is the control, where we didn't apply any crop removal to those trees, and they reduced the crop to the same extent as the ones that we took the crop off intentionally. So the trees actually self-moderated their crop load. They early on said we need to flower, we need to put crop on, but all of that crop fell off just because the trees were so stressed. So that's, I think, you can save some money in trying to put on treatments if you allow the trees to actually moderate their own crop load in that sense. The other thing is that when we looked at the yield, cumulative yield over 4 years from those trees, yes, the extreme deficit treatments did have less yield over those 4 years because they ended up with very little or no yield in the first 2 years. What's interesting is that moderate deficit trees, and they were running at about 67% of the irrigation level that the well irrigated trees got, there was no difference in yield over 4 years. So the trees actually managed that level of stress quite well. So very quickly, a summary of I guess the main focus of what I'm trying to talk about is the problem that we have in drought is that we have a difference between the demand, water demand of the tree, and the supply that we have available, and that causes stress. It's that difference between supply and demand that causes stress. And there's a couple of ways we can think about that and think about managing that stress. One of those is to increase supply. So whether that's to buy in water, whether it's to take water from other plantings and put it onto the ones that we want to keep. By increasing the supply of water, we can decrease the stress and maintain yield. The other option is to actually reduce demand. So whether that's by cutting the trees back, whether it's by certain treatments that will reduce the amount of water that they need. By matching demand and supply, we can reduce stress, we can maintain the health of the trees, we can maintain some level of productivity. So I guess it's really about trying to find what works for your crop in managing that. And I think that's pretty much my time, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. If anybody has any questions, don't forget to use the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. You mentioned in the I guess summaries of the yield determinants in the almonds and citrus, you've got quite a lot of different management options in those boxes, and they do vary a lot across the seasons. Is that do you think that that's partly just, I guess, for want of a better way to phrase it, the trees adapting to the new system, or is it there's a whole range of factors, the soil type and all sorts of other variables that come into play in variety, rootstock, all sorts of, like, sort of a whole system, or is it's just something that the tree just needs to get used to something different?
I think all of those things are relevant. We did do some other investigation of different varieties and rootstocks, and we certainly found clear differences in varieties and rootstocks. So that is an influence. Soil type certainly has something to do with it. But I think trees acclimatise to things. If you make, for example, the conversion to drip, you're changing significantly where the tree is looking for water. And so while there might be long-term benefits, in the short term, it may actually cause stress to the tree in trying to find where's the water now. So yes, adaptation to anything is a pretty important aspect here.
Yeah, okay, just on that, last week, or the last few weeks, we've just completed our round of orchard walks, and there were presentations on nitrogen and irrigation, and they touched on fruit quality. Did you notice any differences? You mentioned yields, but was there any difference or impact on fruit quality and, I guess, nut quality as well in the different irrigation strategies that were applied?
We didn't do fruit quality as in internal quality particularly. What we did look at, so some of the tree renewal processes, so top working and hedging, what people reported was that the fruit was actually better external quality because the trees weren't full of dead sticks. they're actually nice new flush growth, and that made the fruit quality improved, and therefore their return improved. Size is the other aspect, and certainly in citrus, and I'm sure in apples and pears, size matters. And so if you can minimise, if you've got a lot of stress on the tree, or the tree is short of water through that fruit sizing period, that's going to have a big impact on the return for your fruit. Whereas if you can minimise that stress, maybe you get less yield overall, but if you get better quality yield, if you get better, bigger fruit, that's worth more money, you actually could end up being ahead. And so that's certainly an aspect that needs to be thought about. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of numbers to to consider.
Yeah.
We've got a few questions coming in through the Q&A function, which is great. So how important is the type and condition of your irrigation system when coping with drought?
Certainly that's critical. If your irrigation system isn't putting water evenly where you want it, you're wasting water. And so it's critical that the system is operating well. The key thing, I guess, is trying to get the same amount of water to every tree, and therefore then you can manage that, whether it's a lot of water or not much water. At least you know that it's going on evenly to the trees, rather than a whole lot running at the end of the row and being wasted. So yes, I think that's a really critical thing.
Ian's asked, it looks like the partial root zone drying worked on citrus. Have growers continued to use and or adopted PRD since the drought has ended?
To my knowledge, it hasn't been taken up in a big way. So it's an extra level of management. You've got to really be thinking about what you're doing. You've got to be monitoring carefully, and you've got to keep switching from one side to the other, because it's while the soil is drying that you get the response. And once it's dried out, then you're not getting a response anymore, so you need to switch. So the timing of that switching is important, and as far as I know, there's not a lot of people that are still doing that.
So that would require a lot more monitoring on the grower's part as well.
Yes. Yep.
And the last question we've got, is there a difference in yield or stress management against the type of fertilisation? So whether it be for irrigation, suspending fertilisers in the water, and other types of fertiliser application?
That's not something we measured. So I don't believe so. Well, I don't have any evidence to say so. I guess the only thing I would comment there is that if you're putting a lot of fertiliser on and promoting growth in the tree, then you're creating water requirement. You're boosting the canopy and making the tree need more water. So whilst you don't want to cut the fertiliser off, you want the trees to be healthy. You don't want to over-fertilise and promote vegetative growth, because that's kind of working against your water availability issue. So it's a balance. And if you're cutting water, I guess the recommendation will be, if you're cutting water back, cut fertiliser back by a similar amount, so that you're keeping a balance there in the tree.
To whoever asked that question, you might be interested in Nigel Swartz's presentation from the Orchard Walks. He's been working on nitrogen and irrigation in apples specifically. So if you have a look on the APAL website, you'll be able to have a look at his presentation. Okay, if there are no more questions, then we might wind up for today. So if you've got anything else you would like to discuss with Mark, please follow up with him directly, or you can contact us at the APAL office and we'll put you in touch with him. Thanks very much, Mark, for coming to join us and share your research outcomes with us. It's very topical for the apple and pear industry at the moment. There are a lot of regions that are suffering from lack of water. You can find today's presentations in the Future Orchards Library on the APAL website. A recording of the webinar will be made available in a few days. I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. We're going to conduct a short evaluation at the end of the session. So when you leave, you'll see a pop-up box directing you to an online survey, and we'd appreciate if you can take a few minutes to complete that. I'd also like to acknowledge Hort Innovation. This webinar has been funded by the Apple and Pear Industry Research and Development Levy and contributions from the Australian Government. That's managed by Hort Innovation. APAL has more webinars coming up over the next few months, and you can see a summary of those here or on the APAL website. If you are interested in any of those, you can find more information and register to participate on the APAL website under the Events tab. If you've got anything that you're particularly interested in, please let us know. And before you go, I'd like to give you a quick update on the future business activities that are happening. The team are collecting more information about insurance-related data to understand how much businesses are paying for insurance and what type of coverage different businesses have. So we're encouraging small to medium-sized businesses to participate in the data collection process to help understand and advocate on the industry's behalf, because it may mean that a better premium can be obtained through utilising a group buying deal. The data collection will close at the end of July. If you'd like any more information, please reach out to Rochelle Zealy, the Manager of Future Business, by contacting the APAL office. Participation in the data collection process doesn't mean that you're bound to the outcome. It's purely to understand whether we have a high or low incidence of claims and how much businesses are paying for insurance. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. Thanks very much for attending and participating. In the meantime, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks very much.